I'm Max Mawby. I lead the behavioural team at Think's Insight and Strategy. So my history is working to apply insights from behavioural science to help businesses, individuals, and ultimately society get to better outcomes. And one of the missions of our team at Think's is sustainable decisions. So improving those decisions that people make to help us deliver things like net zero. So if you are listening, I'd like you to do a little thought experiment with me. So it's the kind of challenge my team might be brought. So the National Grid stats show that last year, in 2022, about 40% of our electricity was generated by wind, hydro and solar. So that's great because about a decade ago, 40% was coal. Huge system change, lots of investment, lots of things going on driven by companies, government. But many of us will be aware that actually that has resulted in huge challenges in the intermittency of those generation sources. So regulating demand to help us cope with the intermittency is now really, really important. And that's about influencing the behaviour of individuals. That's the kind of thing that my team might be brought. So the National Grid, of course, are working on this, and they've launched something called the Demand Flexibility Service, which pays you to change your use of your electricity. So when there's a need, they will literally pay you to turn off your washing machine. So how do we achieve that behaviour change? That's the kind of challenge that I might be thinking about. Is it enough just to pay people to reduce their use of electricity? I think it's probably not giving anything away to say that I think, no, you need to do something more than paying people. So a common way that teams like mine think about influencing behaviour is instead of pushing people harder, like paying them, you might remove barriers. So take out things that are making it harder for them to change their behaviour. So the first one, if you're already very motivated by the pay, is actually to give you personalised information. So personalisation, something that you feel is more relevant to you, you'll just pay more attention to. It's a truth about humans. So smart meters are a great innovation here. They're in many people's houses now. You have to have a smart meter to participate in the demand flexibility service. That takes away the barrier of not actually knowing when you might need to change your behaviour. But we're not all motivated all of the time. So I think you can imagine if it's 9 o'clock and you get a text from the National Grid and they tell you to turn your fridge off or something, you might not feel super motivated at the time. So if you're not going to pay attention to your electricity demand all of the time, how might we still get this really important flexibility in our grid? So one example that I've worked on in financial decisions and lots of people are talking about to solve behavioural challenges on the race to net zero is automation. So if you have an EV or indeed anything electrical, and it might automatically turn off in response to a request from National Grid's flexibility service. As a behavioural team, I might think, oh, well, that's definitely going to work in terms of delivering the demand flexibility that we need. But if you have your EV and you're charging it overnight and it gets automatically turned off by the National Grid, I think you can think about whether you might find that acceptable. So that's the challenge I'm going to be discussing today with the two people on the stage with me. So there are huge system changes that are happening. And I know there's some maybe frustration with the changes for hydrogen, and we can talk maybe about that, the system changes that might still need to happen. But even if you are delivering huge system changes, it's not enough to deliver net zero. You need to change the behaviour of individuals as well, just as in my thought experiment. And we will all need to accommodate new behaviours that we might not think are in our immediate self-interest, like, for example, turning off your EV in response to demand flexibility. So I'm joined by two people with highly relevant backgrounds to discuss this problem. Dr. Tony Ballance, who is Chief Strategy and Regulation Officer at Cadent Gas, and Lucy Farrow, who's an Associate Partner at Think's Insight. So perhaps if I could ask Tony to introduce himself first.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I said a few words earlier this morning. People might wonder why Cadent, as a gas distribution network, is so interested in consumers. Well, I think the type of changes that we've heard about this morning put the consumer front and center of this debate when we think about home heating, and to be able to understand properly what's going on in consumers' mind, and then we work closely with people like yourselves to think about how we're going to influence some of that behavior. It's a huge challenge, so it needs to be insight-led rather than taking these intransigent positions of hydrogen is good and heat pumps are good. We've got to work out what the right solution is, and that means we've got to really have an insight-led approach to this.
Thanks, Tony. And Lucy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Max. Thanks, Tony. So I'm a social researcher by background. I work with Max at Thinks Insight. I didn't become a social researcher because I loved research. I became a social researcher because I really wanted to understand why some people were doing things about environmental issues and other people weren't. Either you accept the argument that we all need to do some stuff to avoid climate change, or you don't. And there seemed to be this very large group of people who could accept this argument, but then also not do things. And that's fundamentally the kind of question that I'm interested in. I look at it in a slightly different way from Max. So I do, rather than behavioural work, I do the sorts of deliberative projects like citizens' assemblies that engage people in understanding in their thoughts, their opinions, their views, and how those are formed and shaped. I do that partly with Thinks. I'm also a fellow at the University of Lancaster, where I work with the Climate Citizens project there. And that's the kind of work that I do, both with in academia and with people like Cadent. So we've done work with Cadent around the energy crisis towards the end of last year, a project called the Net Zero Diaries, which we ran over an extended period looking at net zero policy. So I'm interested in sort of the bit before you get to behaviours. How do we get people to a position where they are amenable to their behaviour being changed? And that's the thing that I'm interested in.
Thanks, Lucy. So I'm going to ask these two some questions, but I'm hoping, and I imagine I'm probably going to jump up and give you a microphone. You might have some questions, and we can just get a little bit of a debate going. So I'll start with Tony. So you've given us some context for how Cadent kind of sees the challenge of individual behaviour and net zero. But actually, how do you see the challenge of changing people's behaviour to deliver net zero when they might not think it's in their immediate self-interest? And my thought experiment of your EV getting switched off by the national grid.
Yeah, and I touched on this morning by giving some evidence about just how engaged consumers are. So I think consumers feel they want to make a difference, but they feel that it's really jolly hard. And I quoted a number this morning that around 16% of people don't really understand that their gas boiler is a huge contributor to carbon emissions, and therefore you need to be thinking of changing your heating system in order to contribute to delivering net zero and helping with climate change. And I kind of liken the challenge to things. We all do things in our home to help the planet if they're easy to do. So I'm a passionate recycler. Like a lot of people, you put the things in the right boxes. And one of my kind of theories is if we can make it easy, then people will participate. If we make it hard, it is really going to be difficult to shift people's behaviour. So if the ask is, well, we want everybody to shift onto a heat pump, and I'm not saying heat pumps are bad. I said this morning, and I'll repeat it, terrific piece of kit technology that works in the right circumstances, and people should absolutely choose to have that technology if it suits them. But if we think that's going to be the answer for everyone, that's a shift that is going to be really hard. And we've seen in Germany where you try to mandate things like that, it backfires very quickly, and you're left then thinking, well, we need other options. So the obvious one for me is mandating hydrogen-ready boilers, because that enables people to feel, yes, I can get this piece of technology when my boiler packs up, I can have this thing that's ready, and we shall then see, hopefully, that hydrogen comes down the pipeline, using a metaphor there, in due course, that enables me to participate in net zero. And for those that can afford it and want to go for a heat pump, absolutely, that's a great way of going. But we know from the discussion this morning, this change is going to be one of the most difficult changes, and we can't see heating as anything other than a very difficult to decarbonise sector. And a lot of people forget that actually heating is one of the very difficult sectors to decarbonise.
Thanks, Tony. And yeah, I mean, as someone who takes a behavioural approach to things, making things easy is always the first thing we talk about to clients. You know, we say, well, you know, the world's a big, scary place with far more in it than any of us can realistically pay attention to. So if you can just take a few of those difficult things to do out and change things so that good things happen without you having to do too much more, that's a really great place to start. And actually, when you were talking, it made me think of a project years ago I was doing with the Department for the Environment, where they'd got to 50% of waste being recycled, actually just by kind of starting to putting in place all of the things required to allow people who were already motivated to recycle a little bit easier. But it got to 50% and then stuck there for many years. And actually we were starting to think about how do you go beyond making things easy? And that is a more difficult question, as you were pointing out. So now coming to Lucy. So what about from your point of view? When people might not view what they need to do, whether that's a hydrogen ready boiler, whether that's a heat pump, whatever the change is in your home, as not in their immediate self-interest. How can we address that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I guess firstly I'd take a glass half full approach. I didn't get interested in understanding pro-environmental behaviours because nobody was doing them, just not very many people. So that there are people who are doing interesting environmental things. And I think it's worth trying to understand what it is that motivates those people, because maybe there's something we can learn from that, even if some of those people are a bit odd. That's, I think, is fine. So there's a sense that I think in any of these problems you can look both at that kind of perspective of what's missing, but also what do we have that we can build on. I think another example of that is you will all be familiar with the phrase, the tragedy of the commons, which is this idea that everybody will act in their own self-interest until we run out of whatever it is that we're using. The flip side of that is the idea of collective action, which is people acting in the interest of the group rather than the individual. And that's something that came out very strongly in the Net Zero Diaries, which is a project that I did over a really long period of time working with a group of citizens to understand net zero policy. They were very clear that one of the things that was stopping them, even from doing the things that were easy sometimes, was that they didn't feel this sense that those actions were part of a collective effort. And they could describe to us the things that they wanted. So they felt they were more likely to do something when it was part of a clear narrative. At the time, and this work was done in and around COP26, there was a sense that there wasn't a clear strategy for which thing we should be doing, and that was very demotivating. They wanted to see that other people were doing them. They wanted visibility of those things, and that's something that's really important in a behavioural approach. But it can also be something that's important in that kind of bigger approach where we stop thinking about people as consumers and start thinking about them as citizens. Because yes, we all act day to day based on individual actions, but we also are parents and children and citizens, and we have these attitudes and underlying values. So I think for me there's something really interesting about how we address these big challenges, both at the level of the individual action, but also the kind of underlying values and values and opinions that inform those and that provide the backdrop to them. So we can create an environment in which those behavioural interventions are more likely to be successful, and maybe where they are landing in kind of more fertile ground for those actions which are harder. And it's important to be realistic that those actions are the ones that are important right now. My colleague Becky Willis at Lancaster talks about decarbonisation by stealth. The sort of stuff we've done in the back office where we've managed to decarbonise the grid. And there's only so much of that left to do. Where we're getting to now in terms of staying on any of the reasonable pathways is the big unpleasant stuff. So I think that doesn't happen just by making it easier for people. Some of it will be hard.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lucy. So, so talking again from a behavioural point of view, one of the most powerful motivators for action is always just looking at what my neighbour Lucy is doing and actually copying her. It's a concept that's social proof. So if you see people who you think are like you doing something, you are likely to be highly motivated by that. So, there are all these different kinds of tools that come up in the behavioural science literature that we can apply to try and get onto those more difficult behaviours. But I suppose before I kind of develop the discussion on stage, I wonder whether there's anybody who's sitting out here who that initial kind of few words that we've said has brought up any questions that that you have that you want to talk to us. So, do you want to challenge whether a behavioural approach is actually required to deliver net zero? Is there anything that's come up? I will come, if you put your hand up, I will come and hand you my mic. Oh, this man he's thinking about it. Did you put your hand up? No? Yeah.
My name's Layla. I'm with Connect. I just had a quick question about perhaps the generational aspect of this. Will this be such a big issue when children who are now learning about this in school in such a focused manner become adults and are the people responsible of their households? Do you think this will be such a big discussion at that point as well?
Thank you. Maybe Lucy, do you want to have a go at that one first?
Yeah, I can take a little bit of that from a data perspective. So there are some generational variation in attitudes and environmental behaviours. It's not necessarily quite as sharp as you might think, and there's an element of that narrative around future generations which can actually be really tricky. So one of the things that you can find is that people will say, almost any kind of policy research you do, people say, oh, if only there was more education, which you should always be skeptical of, right? Because the problem is not that people don't know. Rarely is that the problem. So there can be a bit of a narrative about future generations will solve this problem, and that might be true, but they probably won't solve the problem by 2050. So there's a kind of real danger in that narrative that it allows us to put off, and that it feeds into a bit of a delay narrative. I do think it is that there are kind of attitudinal shifts that are playing through, but they're probably not enough in and of themselves.
I wonder if I can build in a bit of a question that builds on what you said, which is, if you think about other challenges, like we need to eat less meat and we need to not go to hospital, we need to do things digitally. You can see it with I can see it with my mum. She thinks she has to go to the doctor for treatment, and she's wedded to eating a largely meat-based diet. But you see with a younger age group, the ability to get into eating less meat or being digitally savvy around, having online appointments with your doctor or doing things, via WhatsApp message or whatever, which I'm starting to get used to, but I just wonder if you have thoughts that are relevant in this debate, where I can observe some of those age-related things that do differentiate different people.
Yeah, they definitely do. I think one of the challenges is that much of the decision-making capacity in our society is concentrated in older generations. So that's a real challenge. So one of the things that I'm interested in is how do we engage a broader cross-section of people in making policy and making decisions, because there's something about kind of, younger people will make different decisions in their individual lives. But if they're not the people making the systems decisions, then there's a sort of lag in what happens. There's also something really interesting about how younger people, in particular children, influence their parents. I think that's actually a very strong motivator, is to do things, is because your children come home and tell you that what you're doing is lame, Dad, and you need to get an EV. I think there's something that there are some kind of motivators in that are worth thinking about how we tie those in.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're thinking from a behavioural point of view, we have this concept called moments of change, which for any of you that have made a New Year's resolution, you're literally applying that, right? Like, we are far more likely to change our behaviour at moments of dislocation. So, for example, my colleague Lucy has just come back from maternity leave, and I wonder whether actually you've made some big changes in your life that you might not have anticipated, and actually whether it is something huge like that, or whether it is just a birthday, or whether it is something, like when you move to a new house and actually you are much more open to thinking about what your boiler or your heat source should be at the point at which you move house. And actually, I would say that those points are probably more interesting for those of us who are trying to deliver policy and behaviour change to deliver net zero than the kind of slow but certain change as the generations change. Like that will definitely change things, but I think we're probably working a bit more in the near and short term. But yeah, that's a great question.
I just had a point about, I just thought it was really interesting, like you mentioned they're moving home. I did some work for the Centre for Ageing Better a couple of years ago about, it was called the Good Homes Inquiry, and it was about the number of people in the UK who live in poor quality homes. One of the factors in that is heating, and so we did some really in-depth work looking at why, for many of the people in these situations, they were homeowners. They were actually relatively well off. They probably could have afforded to do the work that they needed to do to upgrade their homes. We looked at what was stopping them from doing it. And there were a bunch of practical things. Information was actually quite a barrier. It wasn't that they didn't know they needed to do something, but they didn't know who they could trust. And that's something that came up in the Energy Diaries work we did with you. People are very uncertain about that there's not one clear voice in the energy or in the net zero space telling people what that they can trust. So that was a challenge. And then the other one in terms of homes, I think that was much more subtle than that, is that we don't really have a very strong culture of thinking of homes as part of a kind of national asset in the UK. We think of that we have a very individualistic model of home ownership, and so the idea that we might choose to improve the national housing stock for future generations was a really strange concept to people, and often in some senses they thought, well, the government's trying to get me to do something for them.
Well, I have heard, and it's anecdotal, that people, in northern Western Europe, that the Dutch and the Germans are much prouder of their heating systems. I don't. Do you have more evidence than my anecdotes?
I mean, I've yet to meet anyone in the UK who's told me proudly. Well, that's not true, actually. I've met my father-in-law. He's very proud of his heating system, but I don't know if that. I refer you to my earlier comments about some early adopters being odd. But I do think there is something, I think, particularly in the context of decarbonising heat, our homes are very strongly tied up with our identities, and that makes change in that space actually quite difficult, both behaviourally, but also in terms of people's attitudes and resistance to change. That's something that we found people are very averse to things being imposed in their own homes. But it's not impossible, because the example that I always use, and I was talking to Max about this earlier, is electric vehicles. And I've been talking to the public about EVs for probably 10 years. And over the last couple of years, we have many fewer conversations about whether they'll work, and many more conversations about how much they cost. Right. All right, yeah, maybe they're still too expensive. But that's gone from a discussion about whether we ought to do it to a discussion about how we do it. And that's in quite a short space of time. Yeah. So I think in terms of heating, what we don't have yet are some of the conditions that sit behind EVs, which is a clear mandate at a kind of government level, a clear consensus from industry that they're making work on it, and also a kind of cultural shift. So there are some sort of conditions around that can shift that conversation in a relatively short space of time. Be interesting to see what that looks like for homes.
Yeah.
So I think that resonates with me in terms... Oh, was there another question?
Hooray. Yes.
I'll be there in a sec.
Run, Max, run.
Thank you very much. Sorry to butt in, but I find this absolutely fascinating. I actually work in a tech startup developing clean tech, but I actually think more could be done by changing people's behaviours than we're going to see with the transition in technologies. And the piece around, everyone's willing to do what's easy, but we've now hit the part where people have got to start making sacrifices effectively. And what I tend to find is everyone's on board with net zero and we need to change. But then you when it comes to making a sacrifice, you realise just how deep that belief is. When it for instance, if you have to stop using your dishwasher or something like that, you realise actually there's quite a low bar for what people are willing to sacrifice, and it's possibly because it's still quite intangible. You know, it's not necessarily directly affecting people here and now, and it may not over the next few years. We had a few hot days which people enjoyed. So yeah, I was just interested in your thoughts on that, and what your kind of experience was in terms of how deeply people actually believe there's a problem, that there's a serious problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, the piece of work that we've done with you guys, what we found is that with the increase in gas prices and electricity prices, the obvious thing was to kind of get a smart meter, look at your bill, but actually people did fairly blunt things like just switch lots of stuff off. So there's a ways to go in all of this, and I would say that that natural gas has been such a convenient way of heating your home for the last however many years, and you switch it on and you whack the temperature up, and I do genuinely believe that we're going to have to shift consumer behavior, because even if you go to a world where hydrogen is the replacement for a good number of properties of their natural gas, it might be that it's an expensive product, so you might have to use it a bit smarter and have a different way of managing your energy situation. Which when you think of electrification, what comes with that is more technical, savvy solutions to making sure that your home stays warm. So I think all I'm doing is kind of building on what you said. There's a way to go to work with consumers to kind of nudge them to think about using their home heating system and the way they interact with their energy generally, to use it smarter, more efficiently, and get used to a different way of heating their homes or using electricity.
Yeah, I think there's some really good points. I think there is something about that. I used the phrase earlier, creating a kind of fertile ground for those nudges. So making clear, creating a collective sense that that's an imperative, that's something that we need to be doing. In response to your question, I think one of the things that I've stopped using attitudes to climate change as a differentiator in recruiting for research, because everybody's concerned about climate change, and actually it doesn't tell you very much about which people are doing things and which things aren't. The differentiator is behaviour now. That's very clear, and that's really interesting, because if everybody's got the same attitudes, then that's obviously not driving the behaviour. There's a bunch of other things driving it, and I think those things are I sort of think of those things as being a Venn diagram. There's some social things in there. There's some social drivers of behaviour. There's some norms and that social proof that Max was talking about. There are some individual factors, and those might be about where you live, your home. Those things will make a big difference in how realistic it is for you to change your behaviour. And then I do think there is a sort of a slightly bigger picture piece, which is about the extent to which people perceive it to be worth doing, even if it's maybe not the cheapest or the absolute easiest thing to do. So thinking about how each of the... And the tech can help with some of those. It can help with that individual circle, definitely. And that then maybe feeds into these social ones. But if you don't have some sort of top-down, I guess, narrative around why we all need to do these things, then those are going to be less effective.
Do you see any kind of net zero or sustainability fatigue that people, it's now becoming quite difficult, so I kind of go, well, this is somebody else needs to sort this out for me because it's hard?
Yeah, there is a little bit of that, especially in the context of there are just like there's a lot of news recently, and that can make it hard to get things to the top of the agenda. I think there's a desire for clarity. There's also a desire for continuity. There's a perception that policy around net zero has chopped and changed. To what extent that's true, that's the perception, is that there hasn't been clear leadership on it and a clear strategy. But I don't think there's this. There is this concern that people in the context of the energy crisis would stop caring about net zero, and that's not really borne out in the polling. People have managed to hold on to both of those ideas and started to make some of those connections between challenges in the broader energy system and an individual thing. So I think that's actually kind of hopeful rather than being a concern.
Okay, so I think we're towards the end of our allotted time. So I wonder if I could ask Tony and then Lucy to maybe say, do you still think a behavioural approach is vital to delivering net zero after sitting on stage and chatting with the people here and us for half an hour?
Yeah, I do, because unless we get into this space, eliciting the change that we want to see is going to be really difficult. And there are easy ways of making the change, hydrogen-ready boilers, and you can see some of those over there. But that's not going to be the only change that we need. There are other things, and how do we nudge that behaviour and, like you say, build up that sense of, as a society, we need to change. We know that was really difficult in the Whitby trial because, to some extent, their personal needs and requirements kind of overtook a societal kind of requirement, which was very strong at the start. So there's a challenge for us.
And Lucy, do you think it's still important?
Yeah, I think I would say it's a necessary but not sufficient condition, which is always a nice way of answering a question. I think I think like Tony says, that there are many solutions which require less behaviour change, but there are other things like, unless the sustainable jet fuel people are really hiding their lights under a bushel, we're probably going to have to fly less. There are sectors that are very, very challenging to decarbonise. Home heating is currently one of those. There's potential for it, but I think that behavioural piece needs to be in the mix. I think overall there's just maybe it's not joined up enough. Maybe there are too many behavioural things happening in isolation of the bigger picture.
Thank you. And I would just agree from a behavioural point of view, like actually what I really don't like is when a team like mine is brought in and we're going to solve everything with just our single behavioural approach, because actually what you often find is that actually changing behaviour is so complex that actually a single intervention that might be drawing on the psychology or behavioural economics literature like my team's does is going to deliver a certain section. But actually in something as challenging as net zero, which involves so many elements of society, so many elements of our daily lives, there's going to be real high-level stuff, like I was hearing from the hall this morning, let's just get on with it, let's get government to take some decisions. Absolutely, delivering net zero is about that. But delivering net zero will be about a layering of interventions all the way down to us switching on or off the heating in the morning or in the evening, or just using it differently. So yeah, obviously I'd agree a behavioural approach is vital to delivering net zero. Thank you everybody for your attention and for your time. And thank you Lucy, and thank you Tony.
Super, thank you.